1970 to 1972. And I got to listen to the stories of how UNEP was created, how it was imagined by people who were putting the environment for the first time on the global agenda. And I discovered that the reason we didn't have a GEO was not because no one had thought of it, as we, of course, often think when we get ideas. It's like, oh, it's a great idea, but nobody has come up with it. Well, they actually had it on the agenda during that preparatory process for Stockholm. George Bush Sr. asked the questions around it. Do we need a World Environment Organization? And a number of governments and experts and scientists discussed and actually articulated the reasons of why we shouldn't have a World Environment Organization. But what we need is a small, agile, flexible body that would coordinate, that would bring coherence. Many of the topics that we've been discussing in this conference, they outlined the functions, they outlined the attributes, they outlined what it will do, how it will perform in the UN system. So, of course, I have subsequently adapted my own arguments and my views and have argued for a different institutional structure than the one when I entered these debates in the late 1990s. So my read of Rio comes from being part of debates not only as an academic and being part of plenary sessions, but much like Pam, who's been on the inside and been in sessions and have actually discussed with governments and helped governments draft text and negotiate and think through what are the different options and what is the framework that confines us in what we can get and how do we get the best possible outcome. So out of that experience, I have to say that I'm much more in agreement with Frank that I do think that Rio was successful in certain regards. And the three areas where I would argue that Rio was a success is one, on the institutional side, and Arne Young and I can discuss on how much was institutional tinkering and how much goes deeper than that. Two, on the Sustainable Development Goals, and we heard yesterday a number of presentations about those. And three, on participation as a principle and as practice. So on the institutional side, the outcome for UNEP was a very positive one. So the outcome of Rio was, to me, not an advancement of the discourse, but was actually a conclusion of a discourse, the completion of the reform debate. The debate on reform of UNEP has started actually very actively in 1997 at the Rio +5 conference in New York. Governments began that debate and they haven't stopped until now. Every few years they actually renew that commitment because governments change. They're like those undergraduates that we get. They actually, it's not the same government the whole time. They change. And the process for reform of UNEP has been going on since 1997 in various iterations, under the General Assembly, under the UNEP Governing Council, and in the preparation for Rio +20. And Rio +20 effectively put a stop on it. We have now an agreement, we have a resolution on what will happen with UNEP. And strengthened and upgraded UNEP means that UNEP received a universal membership in its governing council, and we can discuss what the consequences are, but primarily now it can have the legitimacy of all governments sitting around the table when decisions are made, so no one can say, I wasn't there when that decision was being made, therefore I'm not bound by it. And also vis-a-vis the multilateral environmental agreements, whose conferences of the parties are much larger than the 58 countries that constituted UNEP's governing council. UNEP's finances were also increased, and the importance here is that the new source of funding will come from the UN general budget, which is as close to assessed or mandatory contributions that you could possibly get. Because UNEP currently gets 4% of its budget, or about $6 million, from the UN regular budget. And with this change, it will get a much larger sum, probably about 50 million is what I've heard is being discussed, but that's still under negotiation. That actually turns the clock back to Resolution 2997 of 1972 that established UNEP, and it said that the operations of UNEP's Secretariat will be funded by the UN regular budget, which means that stable, predictable financing for the operations of the Secretariat, which is quite significant, at least for UNEP's operations. The other institutional change that happened was the abolishment of the Commission on Sustainable Development and the replacement with this high-level political forum, which we don't know quite what it would look like, but the very fact that an institution in the UN was abolished is actually a pretty remarkable occurrence. It doesn't happen in the United Nations. And so that's another dissertation topic that I see. What happened? What were the arguments, and why did governments decide to abolish an organization? I will not focus on the SDGs at all. There was plenty of people that spoke about them. And just to conclude, on the participation side, and here's where I come to what Peter was talking, that creation of a possible civil society community. But participation as a practice and as a principle was an important outcome. It actually is in the final document that now civil society, including academia, is almost mandated to be part of the discussions. And it's a different platform upon which one can build the engagement, especially for the Earth System Governance community. Now there is a legitimacy with which to go to governments and say, we need to be part of this process. And modalities can then be created. The voluntary commitments that came out of Rio are in the hundreds. And one of my PhD students is actually going to do a dissertation tracking down how these voluntary commitments will be followed up and what is the accountability mechanism. So there's a lot of scholarly, political advocacy, and pure citizenship work that can happen out based on the outcomes of Rio Plus 20.
Thank you, Maria. I'm really impressed with the group asking the same questions and getting so different answers. I'm really happy about that. So it's a tall order to conclude after these four speakers.
Yes, that was tough to be at the end. I have a feeling it's because maybe you think I'm going to be in the middle. Compromise is the name of two of my books, so maybe that's where I'll fall. Okay, when assessing Rio Plus 20's achievements and challenges, it's important to keep in mind what are realistic expectations. And like others here, I would argue the expectations should have been low, but that they may reflect a more serious concerns than the substantive outcomes, which in some cases did not meet even those low expectations, while they did surpass them in others. So I'm going to make three arguments about why the expectations were right to be low and why we got the outcomes we did. So I'm going to try to step back maybe a little further than some of the other panelists. And I do also want to suggest there were some surprises. In so doing, I'm going to link the outcomes to what they signal about multilateralism more broadly and the prospects for addressing global collective problems. The first reason for low expectations stems from the framing and understanding of the conference by its mainstay sponsors and by the Secretariat.